Hello, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm your host, Andrew Clay Schaefer, ergonaut extraordinaire. As always, we're here to explore people working together with each other and with technology. So today's guest, DaShaun Carter, I've known him for quite a while, maybe not forever, but definitely more than a few years. And he watched the last conversation I had, and he said he was into that. And I said, well, you want to do one? And here we are. So I'll give him a chance to introduce himself, but his tagline on LinkedIn and his socials is deliberately practicing to build, run, and manage better software faster.
Yeah.
Welcome.
I'm happy to be here. I'm already having fun.
Let's do it.
I believe we first met in 2014.
That's a few days ago.
Yep. And it has been.
We should have a 10-year anniversary party.
We should. I could definitely find the date. And if it's up to me, I will come visit you and we'll go hiking.
Tucson might be pretty warm. We'll figure out the date, but if it's a good time of year, there's a perfect hike right next to my house. We'll do it.
That sounds like a great idea.
So what are you working on? Well, actually, what were you working on when I met you?
I was because
that's a fun story, I think.
Tech lead.
Like the conversation we want to have about platforms.
Oh yeah, it is a fun story. I was a tech lead on. It was awesome product, the Garmin Connect platform, which at the time was growing up into kind of the mobile space, right? Going from website to, hey, now everything's on your mobile app and all of those changes, early, 2010s. And we were also growing in people, and the onboarding issue was the big pain point for me. Is like, hey, how do we get people that join the team? How do we get them up and running quickly? I think, it took a while for us to figure out what does our development environment look like, how long does it take to get that first commit, and that was a pain point. I wanted to get people up and running fast. So at the time, Vagrant was still pretty awesome. I'd kind of figured out like, hey, here's how we can get somebody up with a little virtual machine on their box and do some of the things, but it was kind of limited. The product that I was working on was massive.
And this crazy guy showed up.
You showed up, and I'd like to sit in the front row. And what happened was there's this person up on stage I never met. I'd heard some of the things like, you gave your background. I was like, oh, well, I know those things. But then as you talked, I found myself sitting there thinking, like, who in the room told him what to say? Because right now he's in my head. Like, he was talking about all the things that I was struggling with or had recently struggled with, trying to figure out which way to go forward. And it was a surreal experience, because literally you were talking about the things that I was struggling with at the time I was struggling the most, trying to build things and make things better for the rest of my team. So it was magic. And then at the end, right, it was a full room. There's hundreds of engineers in there. And then at the end, there was a small group of my buddies and we got to go into a little room and have a conversation that was even deeper, right? It was even more about like exactly the things that I was struggling with and trying to do for my team. And it was great. I'll never forget it.
I feel like I was just privileged enough to have those struggles before and try to crystallize what I'd seen, the different patterns of failure and success in a way that other people could benefit. And really that describes the last 10 years or so of my career.
Yeah. And the phrase we like to say is like standing on the shoulders of the giants before us, right?
Or the like normal people that are not very big actually, but yeah, stand on their shoulders.
Yes. But it's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful journey from all the things that I learned there.
So at that place, you ended up basically becoming a customer when I was working at Pivotal at the time, and did a bunch of stuff with Cloud Foundry. That was interesting. Also doing a lot of stuff with Spring. obviously.
Right. I was kind of pulled away from the J2EE, Java EE, like, hey, but Spring Boot had recently come out and I'd recently like fell in love with it. I want to get things production ready. I wanted to have visibility and all the other things about making things easy to get to production. So yeah, the Spring conversation. I didn't get to be a Cloud Foundry customer when I was there, but I'd heard about it. You know, my buddies, the other teams were using it, and I was like, that is the way. I saw it. But I was kind of also, you know, with the access that I had, I was kind of building other things to, as much as possible, mimic what was going on.
And then you ended up having some other adventures as like VP of engineering for some startups.
Yes.
And then made your way back to the mothership. So maybe kind of just for the context for the listeners, walk through a little bit of those other experiences and some of the lessons you learned there.
So, branching off, VP of engineering for a startup, having my relationships with the team over at Garmin that was doing Cloud Foundry and having all the success. They were doing all the cool things with Spring Boot. We were having regular lunches, you know, meeting once a month, just like hanging out, you know, sharing stories was great. But also at that time, you were saying the things on Twitter, you were answering feedback, you were communicating and sharing. Like my responsibilities had changed dramatically, right? What my concerns were. The Cloud Foundry option, I wasn't VMware fluent enough to go in and take the open source Cloud Foundry.
I think there's also the aspect of, and I mean, this is going to be related to stuff we want to talk about the present as well, is the, like Cloud Foundry is a pretty big pill to swallow. You have to swallow, and you have to swallow the whole pill.
Yep.
So if you're in a kind of startup, small team, I would never advocate for that big of a pill for a variety of reasons.
So the pill that I swallowed was DCOS.
Well, that's another pill.
So
not quite, it's still big, but not quite as big.
Yep. I had experience with Mesos. So yeah, it was easy. I knew it. And I was able to, it got me to that first milestone and I understood it. So
I think there's an interesting side quest here that we probably shouldn't do today, but this kind of like historical context of the spiritual evolution of these Borg inspired platforms, if you will. So Cloud Foundry, Mesos, and Kubernetes all have this kind of spiritual evolution back to the Borg work at Google.
Yeah, it worked. Like it was working for us. But again, I was trying to build towards what I saw my friends, my colleagues doing, but just, you know, with the budget and the experience that I had, I was doing those things. So we launched a product on DCOS and it went great. It took us 18 months to get that first product out. And then we switched over to Cloud Foundry. So my relationship with Pivotal was great. I had paid them $0 for the first 2 years, but they were kind of fostering like, hey, and just sharing everything. And it was wonderful. And then when we finally started paying, our second product, we launched in 4 months. So same exact team, very similar product, kind of fine-tuned for a slightly different audience. But that drastic change of 18 months to 4 months, it was very visible. It was a big win. It meant a lot. We did a lot. And yeah, we were proud and we were happy. I got to spend more time on the things that mattered. And I was spending less time on the platform. You know, for that small team and that small company, it worked. And then that kind of led me to like, hey, I had fun doing this thing. I'd like to do more. I'd like to share all the good news with everybody. And I found my way into Pivotal.
Which is now VMware, which will now be Broadcom.
Which is now VMware, and yep.
Crazy days.
Yes.
So one thing I say, you know, and depending on what the context and the audience, but I do think this is true, and my relationship changed for a variety of reasons, and I try to stay as technology agnostic as possible right now. But what most organizations desperately want and need with their quote unquote platform initiatives is what Cloud Foundry should have been.
I'm
And there's a lot there, but
yeah, it's still pretty amazing to think about what was actually delivered. Yeah, it was a big pill to swallow, but what it delivered was pretty impressive. And yeah, there's still a lot of mature organizations and mature teams that are still a long way away from those teams that are still running Cloud Foundry today. There's still massive gaps.
And we gave a shout out to Borg and the history, Kubernetes and all that kind of stuff. You also, in my mind, should give a shout out to the OG Heroku, which was like ahead of its time, and then also like ended up in this like weird place with the market.
You're right. And that's funny to think of. Heroku had all this like momentum and this experience, right? This, hey, here's my URL, like go run it. That experience, that's still a desire, right? If people could take that for a spin and see how easy it could be still today, like that.
You literally just put your code in a Git repo.
Yes.
And magic happens. So in your current kind of role, you get to travel around the world. You basically work with a team that I kind of helped build a long time ago. And so you
a lot of the team is still there that you built.
Yeah. Josh Long and the crew, and
yes,
he's his own force of nature. But what are kind of some of the themes that you see and you try to help people with? Earlier we were kind of thinking through some stuff to talk about, and you mentioned the path of least resistance, or like this thread that works, and some of the things that you did in the past, and maybe how you would think about it a little different now.
Right. The thing that I find is that engineers, and I talked about it earlier, it's not always I'm going to fully evaluate, deep dive on the options. A lot of times it's, hey, I've got some options. I try them out. This one got me to the checkbox first, and that's the one that's going to win. If I understand it, it gets me to that checkbox. That's what I'm going to lean into. Versus like, hey, I've made a lot of decisions where I look back and I said, maybe that wasn't the right decision. And sometimes, actually, I'll say most of the time, that's kind of what I see when I'm dealing with the developers. That's what I see. That's kind of a default from that side of things. It's like, hey, I need to get to this milestone, whether I'm working a ticket or trying to get a release out or some kind of deadline, that milestone, whatever it is. If I can get that success, if I can check the box and I understand it, it's going to win. I don't need to look at any other options.
I mean, there's a few dynamic tensions here, right? You have the developer trying to optimize for whatever their kind of pressure, and the product managers or the rest of the org stuff that they have to deal with, and as a consequence, everyone's constantly or developers in particular are forced to choose between doing things right and doing things right now. There's another side quest here about talking about TDD and like some of these other practices. At the same time, when you have technology, the stack is very deep and very wide, and I don't think that anyone can really go understand everything. It's like an intractable task.
And change in organizations is hard.
Yes, that as well.
Yeah. So on the opposite side of the developers, I'm lucky that I get to talk to ops and leadership as well. And I find that a lot of people are trying to do more with less. A lot of orgs are trying to figure out, what's the right way forward. And they're trying to guess at who's going to win. Even in the cases where they have something that's working and has been working for years, they're still trying to follow the leader. Like, hey, no, that's being talked about more. Maybe we should be looking at that. Even though this is working, maybe we should be looking at that, because I think that's where things are going to be at, in 3 to 5 years. It depends.
Well, I'm not going to say what's right or wrong necessarily, but there's, I will say, a preponderance of decision making for all things, but especially in technology, come back to fashion and tribalism more than almost any other consideration.
And I, if I recall correctly, you said those exact same words in 2014.
Well, because these are timeless.
Yes.
Timeless dynamics. Humans are not getting less tribal. I don't know if you're watching the news or anything, but yeah.
I try not to.
Right for the best.
So yeah. So this role isn't anything like I expected it to be. I thought I was going to be like Josh Long, which is impossible to do. And yeah, my role has blossomed into something that I never expected it would. I've gotten to travel more. I've gotten to talk to amazing organizations and be part of amazing events and conferences like the one I was at this week. Like, it is so much better than what I thought it was going to be. Then my expectations have been exceeded, and they continue to be exceeded every month, every quarter. I'm doing something new and interesting.
Well, we don't talk every week, but we haven't really lost contact with each other over the years, and I feel like it's kind of fun to watch your evolution and progression and understanding, and how you're always learning and always trying to, you teach me things, right? When you kind of like go get some of these ideas and drag them back to camp. So
it's one of those things that I like to. That's a part of my mode for, if you weren't aware, a lot of my my big thoughts, I bring them back to you. Kind of like, I like your perspective. I like your take. You always give me another way of looking at things, whether we're talking about platforms or IoT and how we should be delivering to the edge. And is Kubernetes really meant for the edge? Whatever we're talking about, I like our conversations because your perspective has always been wonderful. And it's kind of, it's just a part of my journey. I like to, I've kind of exercised it myself. Now I'm going to give it the Andrew Clay Schaefer test. Like, now let's go and see, have I thought about all the things I need to? Can I present this properly? And also on my career journey, you've been a part of most of the decisions that I've made since about 2014. So it's been wonderful.
My apologies for some of that, but you said it's mostly wonderful, so I'll take a little bit of credit there. I want to kind of go back to something that you said in our setup. We have all these side quest conversations about Kubernetes at the edge and like some of this other stuff that is sort of fun to talk about. But you just say you talk to ops on the other side of devs.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fine framing for the way most organizations have set themselves up. But in what I would consider like an optimal framing, that shouldn't really be two sides. I mean, it's a convenience maybe to talk about it as two sides.
Yep.
But one of the things that I try to help people think through with their, quote unquote platformization is how there's a collective interest, and to this extent that you can connect the collective interest to the selfish interests in those different groups, personas, or whatever, you're going to get a better outcome.
We could talk about DevOps, DevSecOps, DevSecFin, Tech Ops, all the other things, but yeah.
Add more syllables.
Yeah. So we can sell more, right? Like, it's this conversation we even again had it this week. Like, what is DevOps? I'm also a big fan of DevOps Days and helping out with the DevOps Days crew here. And which reminds me, do you still have the adapter from DevOps Days Kansas City that was sent to you in 2019?
I probably do somewhere.
Yes. All right. Excellent. But the conversations that I have, companies, orgs, large and small, there's a statement that was made a while ago, like, hey, if you go out and deliver a new thing on budget, on time, and magic, the great new thing, but nobody's using it 6 months later was a success. And a lot of those things happen, right? Hey, yeah, we bought this thing thinking that it was going to do this. The hypothesis versus the outcome, are they aligned? Did they match? Did it happen? And what do you do? What do you do when things don't align, or things successful delivery, but not successful execution, not successful execution?
Well, I think from my observation, and there's a bunch of incentives that get set up in organizations that overclock or overdrive that initial delivery and don't really account for the ongoing success of the product. So you kind of get rewarded for the initial launch more than you do for maintaining and operating things. And so that kind of contributes to that. I selfishly want to go back to something else you just said, which is this kind of like, what is DevOps confusion and conversation, which is persistent.
Yep.
There's like, what is DevOps? It doesn't have a definition. And then the new annual thing we celebrate is the death of DevOps, which is also kind of hilarious.
Yep. The death of DevOps, Linux on the desktop, and Java is dead, right?
But the way that I would think about whatever DevOps is or whatever DevOps means to people is the reason people get confused is they don't like to have to think about stuff, and they want some very prescriptive paint by the numbers thing that they think will help them. And I don't think anyone ever really spent time with me and didn't come away with the thought that I gave them something pretty prescriptive that I thought would be the best for them. But the prescription should be for their circumstances, for their symptoms, not for just paint by the numbers. Because I think that's what's hurt so many organizations right now. And part of what I consider my mission at Ergonautic is to get people in a space where they're not trying to copy what they heard or saw in a blog post.
Yep.
It's like, what is my problem, and what is my solution based on that? And I don't think DevOps in a web startup should look the same as it looks in an enterprise. And you need to be able to account for those circumstances and the particular considerations and complications of your mission.
So you brought up an example that I've seen many times. It's like, oh, org did this. This is their blog post. This is exactly what they did, and they've gone into great detail about all the things they do. We need to do all those things. We're going to do it just like them. They're successful. We're going to do it just like them.
That ends in sadness and humiliation.
Yes, almost always.
Because you don't have the same preconditions, or you rarely have the same preconditions, and then you rarely have the same winning conditions.
Yep.
So if you can't line up the solution with the preconditions and the winning conditions, then you're going to have a bad time.
And that's the winning conditions. Hey, just because you meet the same outcomes that other org did, was that the right thing for your org? And that's a tough thing. That's a tough question to answer. And sometimes the developers don't know which way's north. That's one of those patterns that I can find if I put orgs into good, better, and best. The best orgs, from a developer perspective, the developers know which way is north. They know where their organization is going. They know what their initiatives are, and it's visible. They can see, like, hey, yeah, we're trying to get here in 5 years, and here's the things that we've done. Here's what's remaining to be done. Those are the orgs that are in the best bucket.
That connects back to the language I was using a moment ago, that what I consider the North Star, or whatever that directional kind of indicator is for you, is the collective outcome.
Yep.
I think what happens for a variety of reasons in a lot of cases is because the organization doesn't have a good central nervous system that communicates the collective strategy that they're trying, this collective outcome that they're trying to accomplish, then it forces all of the individuals to focus on their selfish interests, because they don't understand the collective, but they definitely understand their own interests, and as a consequence they'll optimize for that.
That central nervous system metaphor is making my head race. Like, what would that look like if you could provide a central nervous system to an organization? What would that look like? That's
I think again, it depends based on the scope and scale and the time cycles that are. Like I'm gonna go on another little side rant right here. So I will assert right now that there's a lot of, we'll say, what's the right word? Damage might be a little harsh, but there's this prevailing ideology in some of the kind of DevOps adoption initiatives where we just need to deploy faster. Like if we deploy more times per day, like it's gonna be better somehow. And they overclocked on that one kind of center framing and ended up with not much better outcomes for a variety of reasons. And in a lot of cases, neither their product management organization nor their customer could metabolize the new velocity.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see that pattern over and over again with you either get things where people dumb them down to something that they can implement, going back to agile practices, right? And watching the kind of like, we'll call it, Yoda in the swamp version of TDD and pairing versus the we're going to have a scrum master. How many agile coaches worked at Pivotal when Pivotal existed?
I don't know.
0.
That's amazing. Yeah,
Well,
that was special.
It's just different framing, right? And but like people buy into this idea that you can get a certification in 2 days, and then now you're a master. Like, who wouldn't want that?
Yeah, that's something. This adjusting, hey, more deploys, it makes sense. I definitely adjusted. Hey, I'm going to adjust to this metric. As you do that, you learn. You're going to learn some things about going that way.
I think you're seeing the same dynamic right now where organizations are like, we need a platform team. We'll put them right there between our SRE team and our DevOps team that we already funded that don't work together.
Yeah. The other lesson I've learned, the thing that I've learned, is no matter what metric you're driving towards, you're trying to improve, it doesn't stop, right? You have to readjust. A lot of orgs had this like maturity model, like, hey, if you're doing these things, you're mature. This is our maximum standard, 10 out of 10. You're doing these things. But if that's your bar and it goes year over year, that becomes a problem. You have to kind of reevaluate all of these metrics, right? Hey, if we are going to measure lines of code or whatever, percent coverage, doesn't matter what it is. Once you start saying, hey, this is what we're going to drive towards, there's going to be some diminishing return at some point, and it needs to change. To get more benefit, you're going to have to change that metric that you're going to optimize for.
Do you have any exposure to the double loop learning? It's like a simplified systems thinking thing.
But it sounds interesting.
All right. So it's related to this kind of metrics question, because when you see these like deployed KPIs or OKRs or whatever, they're all kind of metrics in sheep's clothing or whatever. They're all basically. So you have you have some model, hopefully, that you believe if this metric does the thing, then this other outcome is more probable, right? Like that's why you're driving that metric.
Mhm.
or kind of systems of metrics. So the single loop is that you have, some loop of, I mean, all loops are also topologically equivalent, because I get it's silly when people argue over like which loops are better, whatever. But you basically have something that is like a sensor, and then something like an actuator, control system thing, and you're trying to drive the system towards this one metric. And so you measure, and then you do, and then you measure, and then you do, and then you measure and you do, and you're trying to drive that metric, and then hopefully things work out. So that's the single loop. The loop is that you have this measurement, and then you have this action, right? And you can break that down in OODA loop or whatever, plan, do, whatever, that kind of stuff, same thing. Then the double loop would be that when we see that this result, this outcome that we thought we were going to get from driving that metric is not aligning with what we assumed it would be, right? Like we drove it in that direction, and then we didn't get the outcome that we had thought we would. Then we revisit what metrics we should measure, and we revisit what actions and what decisions we should take in the primary loop.
And when do you decide, for whatever initiative or deployment or whatever, when do you decide that no matter how we measure this thing, it's not going to be successful? This idea started.
Well, how many artists have attached their ego to the artwork at that point? That's what makes it hard, right?
Right. One of the things I like to, at least theoretically, propose is like, we're going to do this thing with a hypothesis. Like, let's start here. We're going to do this thing. We think it's going to have this outcome. It's going to take us this long to do. Here's who it's going to affect, but save money, make money, save time. It's going to have some desired outcome. And we think that if we measure it this way, that'll determine whether or not we have success. We're done. We're good. Hey, things didn't really line up with our hypothesis. Now there's a decision that needs to be made. Do we keep going? Does it look like, is there some other measurable outcome that was planned or unplanned that might give us another hypothesis to give this another shot? Or do we abandon it and just say, hey, we spent X amount of time on it, and let's go back. It didn't give us the outcome that we wanted.
So there's a lot of dynamics, and I would say even in kind of science, you have some of these politics, but in a lot of organizations, the statement of a hypothesis never happens.
Right.
There's kind of an assertion about the outcome.
Yep.
And then because of the prevailing political dynamics and culture, it's exceedingly difficult for a leader to admit that something failed, because it's framed in failure and success, not in validation or invalidation of the hypothesis. And as a consequence of that, you kind of get the runaway train effect, where it's clearly a failure, but it's already funded for the next 2 years. So like we're just going to run out the clock and see where it goes.
Funding. A good friend of mine said, show me the org chart, show me how it's funded.
Yeah, I might know that guy.
This model, this approach of, hey, I'm going to do a thing, small box, small time frame, set budget, good or bad, like some outcome, yes or no, yes. It doesn't have to be a success or failure. If you can frame it right, it can be a learning exercise. It can be just a result. Did we find out that this is good or bad? And the leadership that I've had where we were allowed to do those kinds of things, it was a good culture fit. Hey, we could try this. Here's the time box. You have a week, you have 4 months, or whatever it is. You have a time box, no extra budget, some extra budget, whatever it is. And at the end, then we'll evaluate.
It's a privilege to work in those kind of environments, because they're not always present in most organizations. At the same time, I think there's this search for certainty, which betrays a lot of outcomes, because the decisions have to be made with some uncertainty. Like you have to make bets, and you're never going to have full certainty in the outcome, which leads to all these sort of weird gymnastics that people do, like trying to make business plans and business cases and ROI projections, where like it's all basically fantasy, and kind of getting people to this understanding of we're going to test this thing to validate this thing is a much stronger model to drive outcomes. If you go through the lore, I mean, I'm a big fan of learning from other people.
The learning organization.
And there's lots of things that you could probably critique about some things that happen at Amazon, but I have been enamored with the writing culture and the way that they sponsor projects with a fitness function since I heard about it.
Yeah.
And since I had conversations with friends about it. So that you don't try to homogenize the metrics for all these projects and have this PMO with the iron fist across the board, but it's like this thing is born to prove this fitness function or disprove it.
Yeah.
And if it wins that game, it gets to keep playing.
That's good.
And if people don't agree that that's a valuable game to play, then it never gets started.
Yeah. How does an organization learn if you don't have some experiment? You don't have some way of failing to learn. How do you learn if you don't do those exercises?
Well, if you go by the definition that I like to use for learning, which is the ability to change your behavior given new information, I would argue a lot of organizations do not learn.
Okay.
Because they don't change. They don't, like, there's a lot of new information, but they're still doing things the same.
Yes. Back to, hey, here's our maturity model. We're mature, right? Because somebody decided that 3 years ago, and we're going to follow the same thing.
So I'm having fun, but let's drag it back to kind of like these platform conversations that are really happening, if you will. And our friend James Waters just wrote a blog post, which I'm sure you saw. So that might be interesting to riff on for a minute.
I was traveling. I saw the link. I don't think I've read the blog post yet.
But I think, weren't you telling me you were kind of looking at it or working on that before? So it's the golden path stuff with the. So I know you at least had conversations.
We definitely had these conversations. Like, we definitely have this idea, and yeah, got a new name, but for me, it's still the same, right? It's still the same conversation.
It's still everyone wants Heroku.
Even for me, like, the way that I picture this is, I have source code somewhere. I want it to get to production. All the stuff that's in between, that's the path. But I'm a developer. I have source code. I'm going to make a change to the source code. I want those changes to be into production. I don't care if it's on an edge device or on a mainframe or on some platform or a cloud there, or it has to be isolated into that country because of GDPR. Here's my source code. I just want it to get to production where it needs to be. And what does that look like?
I think you just wandered into like a really interesting topic, which is, I've argued multiple sides of this over the years, but I think this idea that developers shouldn't care how their code runs is kind of I don't know what's a good word, farce. And in particular, the example you just gave about GDPR, like, how do you enforce these things, which in that case, it specifically has to do with how code is running in multiple places.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And keeping kind of like governance across this time and space boundary. So that's not necessarily getting into this distinction of like what the infrastructure is doing, but like you pretty quickly get into this rabbit hole around how you're going to do data governance, which doesn't necessarily always live in what most developers would be spending their time on with respect to business logic. So that's an interesting thread to pull on.
It is. How do you define it? Recently we talked about like, yeah, the runtime is one thing. Data is significantly different. This idea of I use the word airspace. Like, hey, here's where things need to be, whether it's for data or GDPR or just my customers. Like, I need my workload to be in this region because that's where X percentage of my customers are. I have to have some distance to customer. It's the customer's gravity, not the data gravity. Customer gravity. That's where I want things to be, by my customers, because latency is the new downtime, right? So let's make them happy. Let's get the whole Wall Street, right? And all the people that were doing all the data on Wall Street, they moved to Wall Street so that their latency would be less and they could be closer to the changes that the market was making.
They can front run the trades. This is where like the non-functional requirements, which a lot of traditional, you're not going to need it, people. I think they just kind of fall apart when you start to run into real production systems, and you actually needed it in the first place. Yeah. I'm going to lead the witness a little bit, which is in kind of like my selfish agenda, which like I started, we're kind of doing some workshops, ergonomic, me and my little crew, what we started calling domain-driven DevOps. And like the fundamental, there's a couple of fundamental things. So the one is recognizing that everything is stream aligned and that everything is software. So the infrastructure as a service is software, the platform as a service is software, and the software is obviously software. And then each of these need to be developed and each of these need to be operated. And then from there, and the reason I bring this up in this context is when you start trying to go through, I don't know if you spend a lot of time doing like event storming or DDD type exercise stuff, but when you start trying to figure out like what's the right domain, what's the bounded context of the platform versus the infrastructure, or the platform versus the software, I think you get into some really nuanced conversations, and there may or may not be a right answer for your context about what should be the responsibility of the platform and what should be the responsibility of the infrastructure and what should be the responsibility of the software. And there's sort of like blurred lines between them. And this notion of data governance is an interesting one that comes out pretty quick if you start to try to build real systems.
I put things into 3 buckets as far as software. The infrastructure bucket, the hardware and the networking, I put that into the infrastructure bucket. And then the abilities bucket, the platform, if you will, but all like my observability, scalability, all the things that are going to run.
The
abilities bucket, yeah.
Abilities
bucket, yes. And then it's the features, the feature bucket. Like what's happening, what's running, what's the business software. That's the feature bucket. And in that bucket, I put the concerns of data. I don't think they sit anywhere else. So as coming from the feature bucket side, hey, here's my code. I want to run it. Where does the data go? I think that
going back to the Heroku and the original, whatever commandments, the propaganda, the 12 factors, like you have to have this backing service, and a 12-factor app is by necessity, it needs a 12-factor platform. It needs a 12-factor ops on the other side of it to fulfill the contract.
Yes.
So if like one of your factors is you're going to write to a data store, a backing data, and decouple that from the stateless features, then that better exist somewhere.
Yes. This is true. And how do we define that? How do we define that backing store, right?
But I've gone a little bit beyond that in some of my kind of thinking which is like, what are the right factors for this app, and what are the promises? And like, I mean, there's a lot of little rabbit holes we could go down, but like auto scaling, like who auto scales? The app auto scales or the platform auto scales?
So as again, I kind of lean towards here's where I'm at. And if I know the app, I think I know who my customer is. Again, I think maybe that's a hypothesis part. Could be wrong, probably is. But I think I can define those things day one. I can say, hey, here's what I think. I think I can also define on its way to production. I think I can define what are the metrics that are going to matter. What are the metrics that we think we're trying to measure for? And there's some constraints. I want to be alerted when this hits or this hits. I want to scale when this hits or this hits. And those things are going to change.
I'm not saying there's a right or wrong.
Yeah, but I think I can define them up front.
The logic goes in the app for how to scale.
I don't know if the logic goes in the app. I think the definition of when to scale could be delivered with the app.
So that's a parameterization for the platform.
Yeah.
That's a configuration with that.
Yep. So
yeah, I mean, it's just a fun time to work on building this stuff.
And again, it's a great time to be a developer, right? There's all of these things. There's all these options for how we can optimize. You know, what is our workflow? What's a workflow that works best for our organization? We can all make jokes about the CNCF landscape and all the options that you have, but one of those options is going to work for a bunch of companies, and it's not going to work for a different set of companies. It's not going to be the right choice, or it is going to be. But there's options. And I like to, when I go down the food aisle and the cereal aisle, there's plenty of options for cereal. One of them is going to work for me. It might not work for you. But having that many options is absolutely okay. The cereal aisle is its own aisle at my store. The whole aisle is cereal, both sides, all the way down.
I do think it's okay. And in some ways, it's probably inevitable.
Yeah.
But I also think a lot individuals and organizations are somewhat confused and a bit paralyzed by the analysis, the overwhelming, like kind of going back to the previous points you're making, where like there's nothing that stands out clear enough for some of those categories. You know, you get like a little bit of a Holy War, Argo, Flux, or whatever, like right. Helm operators or whatever, and it's like not necessarily solved, and it's not necessarily right or wrong.
Until something has changed, until my diet needs to change, I'm sticking with Fruity Pebbles. But when my diet needs to change, and hey, you need more fiber, then I'll go look. Then I'm going to be overwhelmed. Like, is it this one or is it that one? Then I have to do the work.
But also, DaShaun, I'm not sure all people are really conscious of when their diet needs to change.
In my organization, when the way that I've been delivering software needs to change, when it costs us too much money to get that change into production, and we've got to optimize for this, you know, when a decision needs to change, when a direction needs to change, then we go look at what do we do now.
Like from a platform perspective, and from all the work I know you do and the stuff I see, like how many organizations need to change, and is that something that should be changed as a yes, no, or is that a continuous evolution?
We already talked about it. You can't go forward. A good friend of mine said survival is not required. It's not mandatory.
That's actually Deming, but
okay, right. So I quote you when I say it. So this idea of I can't think that things are going to have the same outcomes, even though I'm measuring all my metrics are the same and I'm meeting all my metrics. What about when the situation changes, the market changes, whatever changes? We have to be reevaluating constantly. Do I need a new platform? I don't know. Have I made any insights? Do I have any kind of North Star that tells me that? What's our mission objective? Are we trying to survive? If I'm asking those questions regularly, if I'm quarterly or month or whatever, annually, if I've got some direction, if I'm trying to improve some way, shape, or form, then I go look. That's what I need to do. Hey, son, I'm on a show. I'm going to have you. I'll come back in just a minute. I love you.
We're almost done with him.
We're almost done. Yeah. So That's my answer, is you have to be reevaluating. You could have Cloud Foundry running hundreds of thousands of apps, but is that what you need today? Yes, it's been working great for the last 3 years. Is that what you need today? Or other?
So related to a few of these themes, that something I've been trying to articulate and think through in my own is what is the minimum viable platform, and to what extent can you kind of incrementally improve your platform? And I start this with this kind of premise that everyone has a platform, right? If you presuppose that platform as a service exists, it implies that there's platform that was not as a service, and that if you're deploying code somehow, whether it's the doit5.sh bash scripts or what have you,
Yep.
that you have a platform. And what can you do looking at your current landscape, and then like make incremental improvements. And I'm going to further abuse and extend kind of the previous metaphor we were using, that do you because if you look at most of your apps in kind of like an existing estate, they probably don't cleanly map onto a quote unquote platform, the 12 factor or whatever model is appropriate for you. And so to what extent should you rethink that whole thing and kind of like do this big migration, or can you like incrementally improve the architecture of those apps simultaneously as the platform kind of forms together?
I think that you can move incrementally. I think that there's a way forward. And when I say, yeah, I agree. There's a platform somewhere. What it looks like from start to finish is going to depend, but where things land doesn't really matter. I think that as much as possible, I want the governance, the visibility. I want to be heading in the same direction as an org, whether it lands on the edge or in the cloud or on-prem or whatever. I don't really care. As an org, as leadership, as somebody that's looking at the numbers, or as a developer, it shouldn't matter. As long as we're doing the right thing and we're heading in the right direction. We're making our bets, but we're doing it transparently, not hidden. I think that's where I'm leaning in. That's where I'm taking this conversation. That's where I think it should go.
So I have a few little tricks that I like that I think can help people, and I'm just going to say them out loud. And I'm going to get you like what's your impression, or if you've kind of played with this. So one is going back to this notion of kind of like dev and ops stuff is if you have a legacy estate, but you also want to make investments in this new platform, then maybe you can't get everything kind of to the shape and size where it's deployed on that platform. But one like pretty quick win in some cases is use the platform to instrument and observe the legacy estate. So you basically get your monitoring infrastructure onto the platform, and then connect that back to the legacy, and you're already getting benefit on all those kind of legacy applications, even if they're not fully replatformed.
Love it.
And then the second one is looking to find kind of incremental ways that you can, with different gates and different promises about, because not everything's ready to go, through CI and all the scans and get to the promised land. Give your development teams these sort of milestones, little landing zones, or whatever you want to call them, that they can make incremental progress. Starting with just, can you get this thing to even run in a container? Like, let's not worry about Kubernetes ingress and like, data mesh and all this other stuff. Like, can we just get this thing to run?
Yep. Both valid. Those both map to my way of thinking. The other part of what's typically the conversation, I'm quoting Nate Shuda now. Status quo isn't free. Status quo isn't free. Like, hey, everything worked. Why do I need to change? because it's costing you somewhere.
The greatest lock-in is to your legacy code.
I like that. Yeah. So yeah, this idea, having legacy, having these different end points, these different landing zones, it's okay. They don't all have to land in the same place, right? I.e. mainframe, right? But they don't have to stay there forever either. And it takes that continuous evaluation. And it takes, I think, that transparent, which way are we trying to go?
The way I frame this is the platform can only keep certain promises if you adhere to these constraints. So if you want me to keep all of these promises, and this kind of bleeds into thinking about how you're going to set up SREs and how you're going to set up some of these other responsibilities. But if you can't get to this contract, then I can keep these weaker promises, and maybe that's benefit to you.
That the way that you just framed that, this idea of, hey, platform with different SLAs, like, yeah, hey, or which set of constraints are you trying to conform to? A, B, or C, good, better, best, different SLAs. Different.
Well, it's like the golden path, the silver path, and the bronze.
Oh, there it is. There it is. It's been labeled. It's been labeled. Another.
So we spoke for the better part of an hour now, and I always have fun talking to you, and definitely like hearing about your adventures.
It's always a pleasure. This is
so with that, is kind of like their parting wisdom or anything you want to leave people with, or something that's on your mind, and then we'll call it a day and let you get back to your family.
I don't think so. I'll just quote Nate Shuda. Status quo is not free, and we should be looking at these things and trying to figure out what's the next step.
So is any of this a solved problem?
For some works, for that best bucket of the one little team in the one org, maybe they've got it solved. But now the problem is sharing it, and they're solving it a different way than you should. So don't read their blog post. Don't follow their blog post word for word. Find what's right for you and your work.
So I'm going to end this by saying, having seen and given a lot of talks at conferences, that you shouldn't trust people who are giving talks at conferences to give you anything except for the best version of their reality.
Yep.
And that you, with whatever your struggles are right now, should take solace in the fact that everything is a shit show on the inside.
Yes, that's good. Perfect.
And with that, I'll thank you, DaShaun, again, and look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yes, indeed. Thanks so much. It was my pleasure. So much fun.